It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the clinic had been quieter than usual. I decided to come home early, an impromptu decision, one that would change everything. The kind of decision you look back on and wonder if the universe was steering you toward some cruel revelation. As I opened the front door, I noticed an odd stillness in the house. Kristen's car was in the driveway, but there was no sound from the television, and no music was playing like usual. I shrugged it off, thinking she might be napping or reading. I set my bag down quietly, almost instinctively moving without a sound, like something inside me already knew what I was about to see. I made my way upstairs, and that's when I heard it: low voices, muffled laughter. My heart skipped a beat, my mind trying to reject the possibility. Maybe it's just a phone call, I thought. But as I stepped closer to the bedroom door, reality slapped me hard in the face. There they were, Kristen and Andrew, my colleague, in an embrace too intimate to be misunderstood. My stomach lurched, my chest tightening like a vice. For a brief second, I considered barging in, screaming at them, tearing the room apart. But instead, I just stood there, rooted to the spot, watching. Watching her touch him the way she used to touch me. Watching him kiss her like I had kissed her 1,000 times before. I must have stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a minute. Then, without making a sound, I turned and walked back downstairs. My body was on autopilot. My mind numb, trying to block out the betrayal I had just witnessed. I quietly closed the front door behind me and got into my car. As I drove away, the anger started to simmer, but it was the icy kind of anger. The kind that doesn't explode, it plans. That night, I didn't say a word to Kristen. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask any questions. Instead, I let her carry on as if nothing had changed, like she hadn't just ripped my heart out of my chest and left it bleeding on the bedroom floor. She asked how my day went, and I gave her the usual response: fine. We sat through dinner in silence, the air thick with things unsaid. She had no idea I knew. And that's what gave me the power. The days that followed were an exercise in restraint. I went to work, smiled at patients, performed surgeries, and chatted with Andrew as if I hadn't seen him with my wife. It was almost comical, the way he acted, so casual, so unsuspecting. I had to force myself not to laugh every time we spoke. But behind my calm facade, I was planning. I had no intention of confronting Kristen or Andrew outright. That would be too easy. No, they didn't deserve easy. They deserved something far more calculated, something that would leave a lasting mark. I wanted them to feel the same kind of helplessness, the same kind of betrayal. Late at night, when Kristen thought I was asleep, I would lie awake, thinking. My mind spun with ideas. Ways I could ruin Andrew, destroy his career, humiliate him publicly. It wasn't enough for him to lose Kristen. He had to lose everything. One night, while lying in bed next to her, I made my decision. I knew things about Andrew, things he probably thought no one remembered. Small, seemingly insignificant details that could be twisted into something much bigger, much more damaging. Medical errors he had glossed over, questionable decisions he'd made during surgeries, rumors about his behavior with certain patients. Nothing concrete, but enough to raise suspicion in the right hands. I would start with an anonymous letter. A simple, well-worded accusation was sent to the medical board. It wouldn't take much to light the fuse, and once the investigation began, it would be impossible for him to stop it. I slipped out of bed and went downstairs, my heart racing with anticipation. Sitting at the kitchen table, I wrote the first letter, careful to disguise my handwriting, choosing each word with surgical precision. When I finished, I sealed the envelope and smiled for the first time in days. The game had begun. The letter was simple, just enough to raise eyebrows without drawing too much attention. I mentioned a few incidents I knew Andrew had been involved in, botched procedures, and questionable ethical decisions. Of course, I exaggerated, twisting the facts just enough to make them appear more sinister. It was all written from the perspective of a concerned colleague, a whistleblower looking out for the integrity of the medical profession. 2 days later, I dropped it into the mailbox down the street. Far from our neighborhood. No fingerprints, no trace. The perfect crime, if you could call it that. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day at work, I watched Andrew closely. He carried on with the same smug arrogance as if nothing could touch him. I found it almost amusing, knowing that the wheels were already in motion, that his world was about to crumble. Kristen, of course, remained oblivious. She went about her life, unaware of the storm I had set in motion. Then, about a week after I mailed the letter, the first sign of trouble appeared. Andrew got a call during lunch. I was sitting across from him in the hospital cafeteria when I saw the change in his expression. At first, he smiled, probably assuming it was a routine call. But as the conversation went on, his face turned pale. His hand trembled slightly as he hung up the phone. "Everything okay?" I asked, playing the concerned friend. "Yeah," he muttered, clearly rattled. "Just something with the board. Some review of old cases. Probably nothing." I nodded sympathetically, hiding my satisfaction behind a mask of concern. Inside, I could barely contain my glee. This was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Andrew became more and more agitated. He started avoiding people at work, taking phone calls in private, and rushing out of meetings early. The once confident surgeon was now a man haunted by something he couldn't control. The investigation was underway, and he had no idea where it was coming from. Kristen, meanwhile, started noticing his behavior. She brought it up to me one evening while we were cooking dinner. "Andrew's been acting strange lately," she said casually, chopping vegetables. "He's been so distracted, like something's bothering him." I shrugged, pretending to be disinterested. "Maybe it's just work. You know how stressful it can get." She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She wasn't just concerned about Andrew. She was worried about what his downfall might mean for her. I could tell she was starting to regret everything. Good. She should. Within 2 weeks, the rumors had spread. It wasn't just whispers anymore. People were openly talking about Andrew's review by the medical board. His colleagues grew distant, some even avoiding him altogether. He was no longer the confident, charming doctor everyone admired. He was under suspicion, and in our world, that kind of doubt can be lethal. The next time we crossed paths at the hospital, Andrew looked like a man on the edge. His once pristine white coat was slightly wrinkled, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. I greeted him with a casual, "How's it going?" and he responded with a tight, forced smile. "Just a lot on my plate right now," he said. His voice was strained as if he were holding back the urge to scream. "Hang in there," I said, patting him on the back. "I'm sure it'll blow over soon." But we both knew it wouldn't. Not this time. By the third week, the board had called Andrew in for a formal hearing. The accusations in my letter, coupled with his previous missteps, were enough to warrant a full investigation. Andrew was spiraling, and he knew it. His relationship with Kristen began to fracture under the pressure. She would come home late, frustrated, slamming cupboards and pacing around the house, muttering about how unfair it all was. One night, as we sat in the living room, she finally broke. "This is all such bullshit," she snapped, throwing her phone onto the couch. "They're dragging him through the mud over nothing. It's just," she paused, her voice trembling. "It's destroying him." I looked at her, feigning sympathy, even though the venom in her voice was like music to my ears. "Maybe there's more to it than you know," I suggested, keeping my tone neutral. She stared at me, confusion clouding her face. "What do you mean?" I shrugged. "You know how these things go. Sometimes, what looks like nothing on the surface is just the tip of the iceberg." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might catch on. But she quickly shook her head, dismissing the idea. "No, it's just politics," she muttered. "They always go after the good ones." The irony of her words was almost too much. Andrew wasn't the good one. He was the fool who thought he could take what was mine and get away with it. As the days passed, Kristen became more distant, both from Andrew and from me. She spent her evenings in silence, lost in her thoughts. I could see the cracks forming in her facade. She was beginning to realize that her affair had cost her more than she'd bargained for. But it was too late for regrets. Then, one evening, the final blow came. Kristen received a call from Andrew. I could hear her side of the conversation as I sat in the next room. "What? No. Andrew, they can't." Her voice cracked, and I heard her gasp. "You're serious? They're taking your license?" She was silent for a long moment, then whispered, "I'm so sorry." I stood up and walked into the room, watching as she hung up the phone. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with shock. "Andrew's done," she said, her voice hollow. "He's lost everything." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The damage was done. The dominoes had fallen, just as I had planned. Kristen's affair had destroyed Andrew. Now, it was only a matter of time before it destroyed us too. The days after Andrew lost his license were eerily quiet. Kristen and I barely spoke, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on us. The house, once filled with the warmth of casual conversations and shared dinners, had become a cold, suffocating place. She was mourning Andrew, not just the man, but what he represented. She never admitted it, but I could see it in her eyes. I had taken away her illusion of a better life, her escape, and now she was stuck with me. She tried to reach out a few times, making small talk, but I gave her nothing. It wasn't enough to just ruin Andrew. I needed her to feel the weight of her betrayal, to see how it had infected everything. I wanted her to realize that what she'd broken couldn't be fixed, no matter how hard she tried. One evening, she finally addressed the elephant in the room. "David," she said softly, as we sat at opposite ends of the dining table. "We need to talk." I looked up from my untouched plate, meeting her eyes. There was desperation in them, the kind that came from knowing you've lost control of something important. "About what?" I replied, my voice cold and detached. "About us. About everything that's happened," she said, her voice wavering. "I know things haven't been right between us for a while. Things haven't been right because you lied to me," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. "You lied every single day. You made your choice, Kristen." She flinched at my words, but I didn't feel the slightest bit of guilt. I wanted her to understand the depth of my anger. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it doesn't have to end like this. We can fix this, David. We can try." I stood up abruptly, pushing my chair back with a loud scrape. "Fix this? Do you even hear yourself? You destroyed everything the moment you let him into our house, into our bed. There's no fixing this." Kristen's face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I had given her everything, years of loyalty, love, and trust, and she had thrown it all away for a man who was now nothing more than a disgraced doctor. "I don't know how we got here," she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I stood there, watching her fall apart. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, to comfort her. But the larger part of me knew better. She was only sorry because she'd been caught, because her affair had ended in disaster. There was no real remorse for what she had done to me. Only regret for what it had cost her. "You should have thought of that before," I said quietly, walking out of the dining room, leaving her alone with her tears. I had destroyed Andrew, and now, Kristen was beginning to understand that her betrayal had consequences far beyond her affair. But this was only the start. I wasn't finished yet. In the weeks that followed, our marriage became a slow-motion train wreck. Kristen stopped pretending things were okay. She stopped trying to make small talk or reach out to me. We lived like strangers under the same roof, passing each other in the hallway like ghosts. It was during this time that the financial strain started to take its toll. Andrew's downfall had a ripple effect on the hospital. People started talking about the investigation, about the allegations I had stirred up in my letter. Andrew wasn't the only one whose reputation was tarnished. Our practice, which I had worked so hard to build, was now under scrutiny. Patients started canceling appointments, and the once steady flow of business began to dry up. I hadn't anticipated this. In my quest for revenge, I had overlooked the fact that destroying Andrew's career might also cast a shadow over my own. The hospital administration began to distance themselves from me, politely but firmly suggesting that I take a step back until the rumors died down. Suddenly, the security I had always taken for granted was gone. The steady income that supported our comfortable lifestyle vanished, and with it, our financial stability. Kristen and I were forced to confront the ugly truth: we were bleeding money, and there was no way to stop it. One evening, as I sat in my home office going over the bills, Kristen walked in. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from weeks of stress and sleepless nights. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We can't afford this house anymore. We're drowning, David." I looked up at her, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. The mortgage, the car payments, the private school tuition for our kids, it was all too much. We were living a life we could no longer afford. "We have to sell," she continued, her voice trembling. "We have to downsize, or we'll lose everything." I stared at the pile of bills in front of me, the numbers blurring together. Selling the house would be admitting defeat. It would mean acknowledging that my plan for revenge had backfired, that in my quest to destroy Andrew, I had destroyed my own life as well. "We'll get through this," I said, but even I didn't believe it. Kristen shook her head. "No, we won't. Not like this." We put the house on the market a week later. The reality of our situation hit hard when the realtor gave us an estimate. We would barely break even, and the process would be long and grueling. Kristen was right. We were drowning, and selling the house was our only lifeline. As we packed up our belongings, the finality of it all settled over us. The life we had built together was over, shattered by betrayal and revenge. Kristen tried to hold it together, but I could see the cracks. She had lost Andrew, lost the fantasy of a life with him, and now, she was losing the life we had built together. But she wasn't the only one paying the price. I had thought ruining Andrew would bring me some sense of satisfaction. Some closure. But as I stood in the empty house, boxes packed and ready to be moved, I realized something. I had won the battle, but I had lost the war. And in the end, there was no victory in that. The day we moved out of the house was overcast, fitting for the somber mood that had settled between us. Kristen was quiet as we packed up the last of the boxes, each of us moving mechanically through the motions, avoiding eye contact. The movers worked in silence, and the once vibrant home now echoed with emptiness. This was the house where we had started our life together, where we had made promises, raised our kids, and built our careers. Now, it was just another casualty of what we had both destroyed. Kristen tried one last time to reach out that evening, standing by the doorway as I loaded the final box into the moving truck. "David," she said, her voice strained. "I know I messed up. I know I broke us, but maybe we can still fix it. We can start over, somewhere smaller and simpler. Maybe this is what we need." I stared at her, unable to summon any feeling other than exhaustion. We had spent so long circling each other like wounded animals, waiting for the final blow. Starting over? The thought felt like some cruel joke, a delusion she clung to out of desperation. "Kristen," I began, shaking my head, "there's no starting over. You and we're not the same people who moved into this house. You shattered everything the moment you thought someone else could give you what I couldn't. And now we're both paying for it." Her face crumpled, tears threatening to spill, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not anymore. I wasn't angry like before. I was just tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from knowing that no matter what you do, nothing will ever be the same again. "We've lost everything, David," she whispered, as if saying it out loud made it more real. "The house, the practice, us, it's all gone." "Yeah," I replied flatly, "it is." The silence that followed was heavy. The finality of our situation sinking in. Kristen wiped her eyes and turned away, walking back into the house for the last time. I watched her go, feeling a dull ache in my chest but no desire to stop her. In the end, it didn't matter what we said to each other. We had crossed a line, one that neither of us could come back from. That night, I slept on the floor of our new, much smaller apartment. It felt like a prison, the walls closing in as I stared at the ceiling. There was no peace, no closure, just the nagging thought that everything I had worked for, everything I had loved, was gone. And somehow, I wasn't sure if I had lost more than I had taken from Kristen and Andrew. The weeks passed in a blur. Life moved on, as it always does, though it felt like I was merely going through the motions. Kristen and I lived in the same apartment, but it was clear that the threads connecting us were fraying. We barely spoke unless it was about practical matters, and even then, our conversations were clipped and perfunctory. Andrew, as far as I knew, had left town, retreating into the shadows after losing his medical license. I hadn't heard from him, and I didn't care to. The satisfaction I once imagined I would feel from his downfall had long since evaporated, replaced by a hollow sense of regret. Revenge had come at a steep price, and now I was standing in the wreckage, wondering if it had been worth it. One afternoon, I returned to the apartment to find Kristen sitting at the kitchen table. A pile of papers in front of her. Her face was drawn, her fingers tracing the edges of the documents as if she couldn't bring herself to look up at me. "I filed for divorce," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't need to explain why. We both knew this was inevitable. The house was gone, our lives were unraveling, and all that remained between us was the bitter memory of what we had once shared. I stood there, staring at the papers, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with sadness. Divorce. It was the final nail in the coffin, the official end to everything. "I think it's for the best," I replied, my voice surprisingly calm. She nodded but didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. The following days were filled with paperwork, signatures, and dividing what little we had left. It was a mechanical process, cold and clinical, devoid of the passion that had once defined our relationship. Kristen and I didn't argue over the terms. We both knew there was no point. We had nothing left to fight for. When it was all over, I packed up what few belongings I had and left the apartment. Standing in the doorway, I glanced back at Kristen one last time. She was sitting on the couch, staring at nothing, lost in thought. It struck me then how much we had both changed. The woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. And the same could be said for me. Without a word, I closed the door behind me. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The emptiness of the place echoed the emptiness I felt inside. I had spent so long plotting, scheming, trying to ruin the man who had taken everything from me. And now that I wasn't sure what was left. My practice, once thriving, was a shadow of its former self. The fallout from Andrew's scandal had spread, and though I hadn't been directly implicated, the rumors had tainted my reputation. Patients were wary and hesitant to trust me, and the financial strain had only worsened. I spent most nights alone, nursing a drink and replaying the events of the past year in my mind. Every choice, every decision that had led me to this point. It all felt so far away, like someone else's life. But the consequences were mine to bear. In the end, I had won. I had destroyed Andrew's career, ruined his life, and taken away everything Kristen had hoped for. But as I sat there, staring into the bottom of my glass, I realized something. Revenge hadn't healed me. It hadn't fixed what was broken. All it had done was leave me with a hollow victory, one that had cost me more than I ever anticipated. In the silence of my new apartment, I wondered if I had really won anything at all. Months passed, but the weight of everything that had happened lingered over me like a dark cloud. My life had become a monotonous routine of work and solitude, each day blending into the next. The small apartment I now lived in had become a sort of prison, its four walls reminding me of all that I had lost. Kristen and I had no further contact after the divorce was finalized. I didn't ask about her, and no one offered me updates. I imagined she was trying to rebuild her life in some way, just as I was. But it didn't really matter anymore. We were both living with the consequences of our choices, and that was punishment enough. I threw myself into my work, hoping that if I stayed busy enough, the emptiness I felt would eventually fade. But the practice wasn't what it used to be. The damage from Andrew's downfall had reached further than I had anticipated. Patients still viewed me with suspicion, and business had dwindled to a trickle. Financially, I was barely scraping by, and there were days when I wondered if it was all even worth it. One afternoon, as I sat in my office staring blankly at a patient file, the phone rang. It was an old colleague from the hospital, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He was calling to let me know that a position had opened up at a clinic across the state. Nothing glamorous, but it would be steady work. A fresh start. I hesitated. A fresh start? Was that even possible at this point? Could I walk away from everything here, leave behind the wreckage of my past, and begin again somewhere new? It's not the kind of offer that comes around every day, David, the colleague said, his voice cautious, as if he could sense my reluctance. I know things haven't been easy for you, but this could be your chance to rebuild. Rebuild. That word had haunted me for months. I had tried to rebuild my life after Kristen's betrayal. But instead, I had focused on revenge, on destroying Andrew, and in the process, I had torn everything down. Now, I was being offered a chance to start over. Was I ready for that? I'll think about it, I replied, hanging up the phone. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. The idea of leaving this town, this life I had built, was terrifying. But what was left for me here? A struggling practice, an empty apartment, and a mountain of regret. Maybe it was time to move on. Maybe it was time to finally let go of the past. But letting go was easier said than done. A week after the phone call, I found myself standing outside my apartment building, staring at the skyline. The city stretched out before me, bustling and alive, yet I felt so disconnected from it all. This place had once been my home, a place where I had built my career, my marriage, and my life. Now, it felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. The decision weighed heavily on me. I had spent years here. And even though things had fallen apart, leaving still felt like abandoning a part of myself. But the truth was, staying wasn't helping either. The ghosts of the past haunted every corner, every street, every memory. Kristen had moved on. I didn't know where or how, but I assumed she had found some semblance of peace. I hadn't. I was still trapped in the aftermath of our failed marriage, still grappling with the fallout from Andrew's destruction. I had won the battle but lost everything else. Was there anything left for me here? I couldn't avoid the question any longer. It was time to decide. That evening, I called my colleague back. "I'll take the job," I said, my voice steady, though a part of me felt like I was closing a chapter I wasn't ready to end. "Good," he replied, sounding relieved. "I think this is the right move for you, David. You won't regret it." But would I? The thought lingered as I began the process of shutting down my practice. It wasn't easy. There was paperwork, loose ends to tie up, and patients to inform. Some of them expressed surprise, others disappointment. But most didn't care. I was just another doctor leaving, just another person moving on. As the final days approached, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The anger, the betrayal, the revenge. It all seemed so far away now, like a nightmare I had lived through but couldn't fully remember. What had driven me to such lengths? What had I really gained from all of it? On my last night in the apartment, I sat down with a glass of whiskey, staring out the window at the city lights. I thought about Kristen, about Andrew, about the life we had once shared. I thought about the man I had become, bitter and vengeful, consumed by a desire to make them pay. And I realized something that shook me to my core. In my quest for revenge, I had lost sight of who I was. I had let their betrayal define me, shape me, and turn me into someone I didn't recognize. And now, as I prepared to leave it all behind, I wondered if I could ever find my way back to the person I used to be. Maybe this move would help. Maybe it wouldn't, but I had to try. I had to start somewhere. I took a long sip of whiskey and closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the alcohol burn away the last remnants of my anger. Tomorrow, I would leave this city behind. Tomorrow, I would start over. And maybe, just maybe, I would find some peace in the process. The drive to the new town felt surreal. The highways stretched endlessly in front of me, and with each passing mile, I felt as though I was leaving behind pieces of my old life. The city where I had built my career, my marriage, and ultimately, my destruction was now just a blur in the rearview mirror. I wasn't sure if I felt relief or fear. Maybe both. The new town was quiet, almost quaint, compared to the busy streets I had once called home. It wasn't the kind of place I ever imagined myself living, but at this point, I was willing to accept anything that offered a fresh start. The clinic I would be working at was small, nothing like the bustling hospital I had once thrived in, but it didn't matter anymore. I was no longer chasing prestige or power. All I wanted now was peace. The first few weeks were strange. I moved into a modest apartment, smaller than the one I had left behind but somehow cozier. The clinic staff were polite but distant, treating me with the same professionalism they showed to any new doctor. I hadn't told anyone about my past, about why I had left my old life behind. It wasn't their business, and I wasn't ready to share. I needed time to find myself again before I could explain my fall from grace. Work was steady, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The cases were routine, and the patients were polite and trusting. There were no rumors, no whispers about my past. It was a clean slate, and for a while, I almost convinced myself that I could start over, that I could leave the pain and anger behind. But even in this new place, the memories lingered. They crept up on me in quiet moments. The sound of Kristen's laugh, the smell of our old home, the look in her eyes when I told her it was over. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the fact that my life had been irrevocably changed by the choices I made. One evening, as I sat on the small balcony of my apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found myself thinking about Andrew. I hadn't heard anything about him since I left. For all I knew, he had disappeared completely. His career in ruins. I had gotten what I wanted, revenge, but it didn't feel the way I thought it would. Instead of triumph, I felt emptiness. I realized then that starting over wasn't just about leaving behind the physical remnants of my old life. It was about letting go of the anger and bitterness that had consumed me. But that was easier said than done. As the sky turned dark and the stars began to appear, I wondered if I would ever truly be free of the past. Maybe, like the stars, it would always be there, a distant reminder of what had been. One morning, about a month after I had settled into my new routine, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to since the divorce, someone who knew everything about what had happened between Kristen, Andrew, and me. "David, I'm sorry to call you out of the blue like this," he said, his voice hesitant, "but I thought you should know. Kristen's in town. She's looking for you. I froze, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thick to breathe. Kristen? Here? In this quiet, small town that I had chosen to escape to? Why? I asked, my voice barely steady. I don't know the details, but she wants to talk. She says she has something important to tell you. I ended the call quickly, my mind racing. What could she possibly have to say after all this time? I had left that life behind. I had started over. I didn't need her reopening old wounds. But curiosity gnawed at me. A part of me wanted to hear her out, to understand why she had come all this way. Another part, the part that still bore the scars of her betrayal, wanted nothing to do with her. That evening, as I left the clinic, I spotted her. She was standing across the street, her hands clasped together nervously, her eyes scanning the street for me. She looked different, older, more tired, but she was still the same woman I had loved, the same woman I had hated for so long. I could have turned and walked away. I could have avoided her altogether. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the same need for closure that had driven me to destroy Andrew. Maybe it was a glimmer of the man I used to be before all the anger and bitterness had taken over. So I walked across the street, each step feeling heavier than the last until I was standing in front of her. "David," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think you'd come. What are you doing here, Kristen?" I asked, my tone cold but not as sharp as I intended. I had imagined this moment 100 times, rehearsed what I would say if I ever saw her again. But now, standing in front of her, I felt nothing but exhaustion. "I wanted to talk," she said, her eyes searching mine for some sign of emotion. "I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I needed to explain, to apologize." I didn't say anything. I didn't know what there was to apologize for that hadn't already been said. What could she possibly say to change anything now? I was wrong, she continued, her voice trembling. I was wrong about everything. About Andrew, about us. I thought I wanted something else, something more. But I didn't. I was just lost. I listened in silence, the anger I had once felt toward her strangely absent. All I could feel now was a deep, hollow sadness for what we had lost. "I know I can't undo what I did," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, David." I looked at her, at the woman who had once been my whole world. And I realized something. It didn't matter anymore. The betrayal, the revenge, the anger. It was all part of a past that I had been trying so hard to escape. And now, standing here with her, I finally understood that holding on to that anger was only keeping me trapped. "I forgive you," I said quietly, surprising even myself. Kristen's eyes widened, and she let out a shaky breath. "You do?" "I do," I replied, meaning it. "But that doesn't change anything. We're different people now. What happened between us, it's done." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know. I needed to hear that." We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything that had passed between us finally lifting. I had spent so long trying to destroy her, to make her pay for what she had done, but in the end, I was the one who needed to let go. "Goodbye, Kristen," I said, turning to walk away. As I walked down the quiet street, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from victory or revenge, but the kind that comes from finally letting go. Maybe, just maybe, I was ready to start living again. In the weeks following my final conversation with Kristen, I felt a sense of clarity settle over my life. There were no dramatic revelations or epiphanies, just the gradual realization that I had truly moved on. The anger and bitterness that had once consumed me no longer held any sway over my thoughts. I began to focus on the small joys of everyday life. My work at the clinic, though unremarkable, provided a sense of stability I hadn't felt in years. My interactions with patients became more genuine, and I no longer carried the weight of my past into the examination room. For the first time in a long while, I found myself connecting with people again, not as a bitter, vengeful man, but as someone simply trying to do his best. Outside of work, I embraced the quiet solitude of my new town. I took long walks through the park near my apartment, appreciating the simplicity of it all, the sound of birds, the rustle of leaves, the warmth of the sun on my skin. These were things I had once taken for granted, Things I had been too angry or distracted to notice during the chaos of my life with Kristen. Occasionally, thoughts of her would surface. I would wonder how she was doing, whether she had found her own peace. But I didn't dwell on it. Our chapter was over, and no amount of dwelling could rewrite it. I had forgiven her, and in doing so, I had freed myself. One evening, after a particularly long day at the clinic, I found myself sitting at a small bar a few blocks from my apartment. The place was quiet, with only a handful of patrons scattered around. I ordered a drink and took a seat at the bar, letting the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses wash over me. As I sipped my whiskey, I noticed a man sitting a few seats down. He was older, with graying hair and a tired look in his eyes. Something about him seemed familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. We made brief eye contact, and after a moment, he slid over to the seat next to mine. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice rough but friendly. "Not at all," I replied, nodding toward the empty seat. He sat down and ordered a drink, glancing at me as if trying to place me as well. "You're new around here, aren't you?" "Yeah," I said, taking another sip. "Moved here a few months ago." "Thought so. I've been in this town for over 20 years. Don't see too many new faces around here." He paused, studying me. "You look like someone who's had his share of life's ups and downs." I chuckled, feeling the weight of his words. "You could say that." We talked for a while, exchanging stories about life, work, and the paths that had led us to this moment. His name was Frank, and like me, he had left behind a life filled with complications and regrets. As we spoke, I realized how similar our journeys were, two men who had been beaten down by life, now just trying to find some semblance of peace. At some point in the conversation, Frank said something that struck me. "You know, I used to think the past was something you could just outrun. But no matter how far you go, it's always there, waiting for you to face it." I nodded slowly, feeling the truth of his words. "I used to think revenge was the answer," I said, surprising myself by how candid I was being. "But it didn't fix anything. It just made me more lost." Frank looked at me with a knowing smile. "Yeah, revenge has a way of doing that. You think it'll heal you. But all it does is leave more scars." We sat in silence for a while, both of us reflecting on our own scars. At that moment, I realized that my conversation with Frank was another form of closure, an unexpected one, but closure nonetheless. It wasn't just about Kristen or Andrew anymore, it was about accepting that life doesn't always go the way you planned. And that was okay. When I left the bar that night, I felt lighter, as if a final burden had been lifted from my shoulders. I didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of it. The clinic had become a place of routine and comfort, but as time passed, I began to feel a restlessness stirring within me. It was a quiet feeling at first, like the faint sound of a distant storm, but it grew louder with each passing day. I had started over here, but now I wondered if I was truly living or just existing. One afternoon, as I sat in my office between appointments, I received an email from an old colleague. He had moved to a larger city several hours away and was now running a thriving practice. In the email, he mentioned an opportunity, an opening at his clinic for a senior physician. It was a chance to take on more responsibility, to challenge myself again. I stared at the screen for a long time, considering the offer. A part of me was hesitant. I had worked so hard to find peace here, in this quiet town. Taking on a new role in a bigger city meant returning to the fast-paced life I had left behind. But another part of me, the part that had always thrived on ambition and challenge, felt a spark of excitement. Could I really do it? Could I leave behind this new life I had built and step back into the unknown? That evening, I went for a walk through the park, letting my thoughts swirl around me. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, and for a moment, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had happened, the good and the bad. It had all led me here, to this moment, where I stood at a crossroads. I thought about the man I had been before, the man who had been consumed by ambition, by the need for control. And then I thought about the man I had become, the one who had learned to let go, to forgive, to find peace in the quiet moments. But maybe there was a way to merge the two. Maybe I didn't have to choose between ambition and peace. Maybe, for the first time in my life, I could find a balance. By the time I returned to my apartment, I had made my decision. I sat down at my desk and drafted a reply to the email, accepting the position. It was a new challenge, yes, but this time, I would approach it with the lessons I had learned. I wouldn't let it consume me. The next morning, I handed in my notice at the clinic. The staff were surprised but supportive, understanding that I needed to follow my own path. As I packed up my office, I felt a sense of closure, not just with my time here but with everything that had come before. I was ready for whatever came next. As I drove out of town, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The small town that had given me a fresh start faded into the distance, and ahead of me, the open road stretched out, full of possibility. This time, I wasn't running from my past. I was moving forward, finally free. The drive to the new city felt different from the last time I had packed up and left. The air was lighter, the road less daunting, and my thoughts were clearer. I wasn't escaping anymore. I wasn't trying to outrun the ghosts of my past or seeking refuge from the wreckage I had left behind. This time, I was stepping into the future, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what might lie ahead. The city came into view, a blend of towering skyscrapers and the hum of life I hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. As I drove through the bustling streets, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if something new was on the horizon, waiting for me to embrace it. The clinic was a sleek, modern building in the heart of the city. The kind of place I had once dreamed of working in before my life had taken such unexpected turns. As I walked through the glass doors, I was greeted by a receptionist who smiled warmly and directed me to meet with my new colleague, an old friend, someone who had once worked alongside me back in my more ambitious days. David, he greeted me as I entered his office, his eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "It's good to see you again. Welcome to your new home." We exchanged pleasantries, and as we talked about the clinic and the team, I realized how much I had missed this, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. But unlike before, I wasn't here to prove myself. I wasn't here to chase recognition or status. I was here because I wanted to be. Because I had chosen this path. Over the next few weeks, I settled into my new role. The work was challenging, the pace fast, but I found myself thriving in it. The balance I had once thought impossible now seemed attainable. I worked hard, but I didn't lose myself in the process. I left the office at a reasonable hour, I took time for myself, and I found a sense of joy in the small victories. Helping a patient, mentoring a younger doctor, and building something meaningful. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found myself standing on the balcony of my new apartment. Overlooking the city, the lights twinkled in the distance, and the sounds of the city, a mix of laughter, traffic, and life, filled the air. I felt a quiet sense of contentment that I hadn't known in a long time. As I stood there, I thought about everything that had led me to this point. Kristen, Andrew, the betrayal, the revenge, it all felt like a lifetime ago. I had spent so much time trying to control everything, trying to force my life into a perfect shape, but in the end, it was the letting go that had set me free. I learned that life doesn't always follow the plans we make. It twists and turns, sometimes violently, throwing us off course. But that doesn't mean we can't find our way again. Sometimes, the detours lead us to places we never imagined we'd go. And sometimes, those places are exactly where we're meant to be. For so long, I had been focused on the past, on the mistakes I had made, the mistakes others had made. But standing there, looking out over the city, I realized that the future was wide open. It wasn't about redemption or erasing what had happened. It was about moving forward with the lessons I had learned. The next day at the clinic, I was assigned a new patient, a young man who had just finished medical school and was starting his residency. He reminded me of myself all those years ago, filled with ambition, hope, and maybe a little arrogance. He looked nervous as he entered my office, and I could tell he was trying hard to make a good impression. "Dr. Bennett," he said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to work with you." I shook his hand and smiled. "It's just David. No need for formality." He nodded, still a little unsure, and I could see the weight of expectations already pressing down on him. Expectations from his family, from his professors, from himself. I saw a younger version of myself in him, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. I wanted to tell him that it was okay to make mistakes, that it was okay to not have everything figured out. But I knew he'd have to learn that on his own, just as I had. Instead, I said, "You're going to do great here. Just remember to take it one step at a time. And don't be afraid to ask for help." He smiled, visibly relieved. "Thanks, David. I appreciate that." As he left the room, I felt a sense of purpose settle over me. I wasn't just here to rebuild my life. I was here to guide others, to help them navigate the same challenges I had faced. I had spent so long believing that success was about power, about being the best. But now I know that true success wasn't about what you achieved. It was about who you became along the way. It was about how you treated the people around you, how you handled failure, how you learned to let go and move forward. I had come full circle, but I was a different man now. A better man, I hoped. As I left the clinic that evening, the city lights glowing in the distance, I felt a deep sense of peace. The future was uncertain, as it always was, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready to embrace whatever came next. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly moving forward.